Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, we're doing Q&A. I promised an AMA episode a while back. I put out a call for questions on X. I got a bunch of great responses. I've been collecting questions ever since. You guys have asked some real gems. There's going to be a lot of really fun things for us to get into. I'm super excited to be doing this today. We're going to have some fun. I have a whole list of questions that I have put together. We're going to see how many of these we can get through in the next 30 minutes or so. Let's dig in. All right, question number 1. What do you think is the best way to teach a kid to read? I love this question. The very simple one-word answer is phonics. Whatever you do not teach your kid via the whole word or the look-say method. That being said, there are a lot of strategies that you can use to teach your kids phonics. It does not have to be super complicated. It is something that you can integrate into your day-to-day life. There are a few different ways that I like thinking about approaching literacy. There's kind of 2 buckets. One is very sort of on the fly, kind of passive in your day-to-day, exposing your kids to the sounds letters make, which sounds fairly basic and straightforward, but honestly, the bulk of understanding phonics is recognizing letters and understanding the sounds that those letters make so that you can start deconstructing words and sounding them out to understand their meaning. There's lots of different ways that you can do this. You can play word games with your kids. I had a great episode a few weeks back with Samantha Westmoreland from Higher Ground or Guidepost Montessori. She's amazing. And we talked a lot about the Montessori approach to literacy, and she outlined a bunch of different word games that you can play with kids to encourage them to start sounding out the different sounds in words and start to think about phonics from a sort of top-down, like words to sounds perspective. Playing word games is really fun. Asking your kids if they can think of words that start with a certain sound or pointing out letters as you see them in the real world. These are things that you can do on the fly with your kids. And then there's, actual formal phonics instruction where you either write down the sounds yourself and have the kids memorize them, or you have them writing down the letters with you, and then you're, making the different sounds and then assembling them. It doesn't have to be super complicated. There are tons of great books out there on teaching your kids phonics that you can reference. But honestly, the approach that I think is the most fun is integrating these sort of word games and wordplay into your day-to-day life. And if you're reading to your kids a lot and you're taking the time to point out different letters to them and kind of point out different words as you're saying them, that's going to give them a lot of material to get started with engaging with phonics. All right, question number 2. I've been thinking about curricula a lot lately. What is the best way to create a well-rounded curriculum for homeschooling kids? I love this question. I don't talk about curriculum design on the podcast nearly as much as I probably should, considering how much I actually find it fascinating. So I think you can break the way you think about a curriculum out into 2 parts. There's the stuff that you need to know, particularly if you're planning on taking standardized tests, if you want to ace the SAT, if you want to have all the boxes checked that you need to get into a college. And then there's all the stuff you actually find interesting. And sometimes those 2 things overlap, and sometimes they're 2 completely separate threads of exploration. But for the more, like, we'll call it standard academic or traditional academic track type of materials, I think you can design a curriculum fairly simply by just looking at the standards. If you look at the standards for the state that you're in, you can get a pretty clear baseline for what a child is expected to know or be able to engage with at each grade level. And you can build a basic curriculum around that. Really the core building blocks of unlocking all the other subjects and all the other information. It really is the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. So if you're making sure that you have your child's education on those 3 things really dialed in, and you're loosely meeting the state standards for the year or grade that your child is in, you're already very far along the right path. To actually design the technical curriculum, like the resources that you're using, for the basics, lots of homeschoolers that I know really love IXL. Obviously, there are free resources online like Khan Academy. There are lots of different apps that specialize in teaching different subjects. But in general, IXL seems to be the one that the most people I talk to have a good experience with. And it's also just a really solid curriculum. So that's the one that I most often direct people towards if they have the resources to put a little bit of money into a monthly subscription for a product. Once you have the sort of, again, technical academic curriculum on lockdown, you get to the fun part, which is the actual, what I think you're referring to in this question by a well-rounded curriculum. You get to all of the other things that we as humans want to know about that give us color and context on having a human experience and the world around us. Um, all of the fun things that school sort of writes off as being electives. For that side of the curriculum, I would think both about your child's interests and the invitations that you are giving your child. So your kid probably is already more innately interested in certain subjects than others. And I would cater to that as much as possible in the curriculum that you're designing. If your kid is really interested in history, I would allow them to spend as much time on that as possible. But if there are things that you think are important for your child to be exposed to, I would at the very least bring those things into your space as invitations for your kid to explore. Maybe you have a CD player with a stack of classical music CDs because you think classical music's really important for your kid to be exposed to, and you want that invitation there for them to be able to engage with whenever their curiosity gets piqued. Maybe you have art supplies because you want your kid to be exposed to art, or you have prints on the wall of sketches and different types of painting and different mediums because you want, again, your kid to be exposed to this side of reality that you think is important. I think well-rounded is a moving target because everybody has a different opinion on what a well-rounded education is. In my opinion, it means you've exposed your kids to the basic building blocks of understanding information. You've exposed them to rigorous thinking and how to become self-aware of their own thinking processes. And you've exposed them to a wide array of different subjects and topics, but you've also allowed them to explore the areas that they're most interested in and most curious about. These are the broad strokes that I would use to think about designing a curriculum. I think it's very child specific. I think that a well-rounded curriculum is going to look different for each child if it is done well, if it's honoring the unique interests and proclivities of the child the curriculum is being designed for. But I also think a good, well-rounded curriculum is one that exposes a child very widely to all the world has to offer. You can't force a kid to be curious about something, and I don't think you should, but you also can't expect them to be curious about something that they don't even know exists. Question number 3. Do you think the education system can be reformed, or do we need a different system? I don't think public education in America is ever going to be the best option for somebody who is looking for a good education for their kids. It performs on a sliding scale. Some schools do much better than others. Some schools deliver better outcomes and a better student experience to their students than others. But I think a lot of the problems that I talk about and harp on are things that are indivisible from the system. They come from the fact that it is a system designed in the way that it is. I am skeptical of an education system being able to deliver a top tier education, full stop. You can create a system that delivers an adequate education, but when you start thinking system-wide, you lose the ability to think about the individual child, and I think the individual child is so important. I think it's the crux of everything. In my dream world, I would love to see education in America delivered on a local level where there are products and tools and curricula and software that are being delivered on a national level, not coming from the government, coming from private organizations and businesses that are building these tools and that are at the mercy of the sentiments of the market, so that if their tools are not delivering good results, they have a deep and immediate financial interest in correcting those issues for their customers. But I think the education itself needs to be delivered on a local level. I would love to see a proliferation of micro schools, of local schools, of smaller organizations where the people running them actually know the name of every child enrolled in their school, because I think that's how you deliver better, more tailored, more pointed results for the students that you're trying to serve. I don't think the system can be reformed. I also don't think it's going away. I think that we can do our best to improve it as much as possible, but I don't ever think it will be the ideal system. And what I would like to see is a freer market for education where there's less of a monopoly in the public sector and where families can easily choose the option that's the best fit for their students. And I think that when that equilibrium is reached, the best option will more often than not be coming from the private sector and be coming from smaller and more localized schools. Okay, next question. How do we protect kids in classrooms from the system influencers once Trump begins the education reform process? Okay, this is sort of at the crux of everything I talk about. I don't think kids in schools should be affected by who is in government on a national level. I don't even think they should be deeply affected by who is in government at a state level, but they certainly shouldn't be deeply affected by national elections. The day-to-day lives of children should not be that tightly tied to people who have never met them, who don't know their names, who the people in their region may not have even collectively voted for. I think the fact that we even have to ask this question is a core part of the problem. Education needs to come back to a local level. It has to come back to the families and the communities who actually care about the kids they're serving. Because if you're thinking on a systems level, you can't be thinking about the individual kids. And that inherently means that you're doing the kids a disservice. This one was a rhetorical question. When do we trust the government for anything else? Exactly. That is the question that everybody should be asking. Okay, this one's an interesting one. What does private/public school provide that cannot be obtained by a homeschool family? I think this is a really important question for families to ask if they're seriously considering homeschooling. There are things that public and private school offer that are harder for a homeschool family to replicate. One is the mass social experience that a kid has when they go into a large school. I've talked about this before. I would argue that that social experience is A, not necessary, and B, probably not even constructive for the average kid. But it is a thing that it's hard for homeschoolers to replicate. And it is something that should be weighed in the decision-making process of whether or not you're going to pull your kid from a larger education institution. Sports, obviously, this depends a little bit on where you are located. In Pennsylvania, where I grew up, schools were legally required to let homeschoolers enroll in all of their sports and also any classes at the school, as long as they had room, as long as the class wasn't already full with kids who were full-time enrolled at the school. They had to let homeschoolers in. I thought that was a really cool policy. I benefited from that as a child. Not every state has that policy. In some places, you can't play public school sports if you're not enrolled at the public school. And that's a thing that the families have to turn to the free market to be able to replace. They have to sign up for club sports. That's not always an option, either financially or just they live in a place where those club sports don't exist. So that is one thing that public and private schools provide that are harder for homeschool families to replicate depending on where they're geographically located. What else? Public school lunches, bullying, school hall culture. Like there's lots of things that public schools and large private schools provide that homeschool families don't, and can't. Not all of them are bad things. Um, in general, though, I think most things that a kid gets in private or public school can be replicated on the homeschool level. The academics can be replicated. The mentorship of other adult figures can be replicated without your kid having to be in school all day. Um, the social experience of getting to interact with lots of different people, you can get that in lots of places. People don't only socialize in school and nowhere else. Um, there are lots of options for nearly everything that public and private school provides, as long as you're willing to get creative about thinking through, okay, what are the actual components of this and how can we replicate it elsewhere? And thinking about your options of where else your child can get those types of experiences that aren't necessarily a classroom. Okay. I'd like your resources and recommendations for teaching entrepreneurship and sales skills to students. One of my favorite topics. I think every kid should, at some point in their childhood, engage in an entrepreneurial venture, even if it's something as small as setting up a lemonade stand on the corner for an afternoon. And practicing their sales skills is a really important life skill. So, one of my favorite resources is Children's Entrepreneurship Market. You should Google this. My friend Connor Boyack started and runs this. These markets happen all over the country, and they're basically markets, like a farmer's market, where kids can go and sell the things that they have created. They can sell handmade goods that they've created, crafts, art, all sorts of things. These are really amazing environments for your kid to go and get some real world entrepreneurship and sales experience. But your kid doesn't need a child designated market to practice these sorts of things. Some farmers markets have kids booths where if you are a kid who has a craft business or some other type of small business, you can have that booth for a Saturday or a Sunday and you can sell your goods. Kids can do online businesses, especially when they get into their teen years. They can sell on Etsy. When I was a kid, I was selling handmade dolls to the moms in our homeschool group and then was consigning them at the yard store where I bought my supplies. There's tons of real world places where your kid can go and sell things that they're making. They can sell services. They can start a little lawn mowing business in the neighborhood. I really think the best way for your kids to learn these types of things is through real world experience. There's not like a curriculum or something that I recommend for this. I think exposing your kid to stories of other kids who have done this sort of thing for them to draw inspiration from, and then just encouraging them if they're crafting something that you think is really cool, encouraging them to sell it somewhere, encouraging them to try. Um, I think that's the most valuable way to start to expose them to this, but really the best learning when it comes to business is usually by doing. All right, next question. What is proper socialization and why are public school kids lacking in social skills? Don't get me started. I don't think what people call socialization when they're talking about public school is proper socialization at all. Where else in the real world are kids going to interact with people who are only born in the same year as them and in the same zip code and who have the same like grade level aptitude? Is completely superficial. And it's a completely warped skill set. The skills you need to interact with your class bully are not the same skills that you need almost anywhere else in the real world. I think that proper socialization is actually learning how to interact with people of different age ranges, from different backgrounds, in different contexts, and preferably a lot of real world contexts. So, interacting with someone who is an adult and who works at the grocery store or works at the farmer's market, or an older kid who you hang out with at your homeschool co-op, or a younger kid that you're babysitting or teaching something to, or an adult who is your friend's grandma who you're comfortable having a conversation with because every adult figure that you interact with isn't just an authority figure. These are the types of social interactions that teach you the same types of skills that you're going to need in the real world. And I think they're the most valuable types of socialization a child can have. In terms of building skills, I honestly think that the types of interactions that happen in the classroom and on the schoolyard are very low on the list of how much a kid is actually gaining from each individual experience. All right, next question. How can we create a student-centric education system free of the damage done by the current teacher-centric model? Again, I think you have to go local. I think you have to go small. I think even if you are building a system or a network of schools that's spanning the country, and I know a lot of amazing people who are, I've had a lot of them on my show, you still have to have really amazing people on the ground at the local level, amazing heads of school, amazing teachers who are building that local community in each geographic location, because that's where the magic happens and that's where the lines are actually drawn. Whether or not your kid is getting a great experience, it really comes down to who's running your school, how well do they know the kids, and how well are they catering to those kids in each classroom. I think you can create really great curriculum that can scale to a system, like a broad systemic level. I think you can create really great structures in terms of educational approaches, software tools, infrastructure that can scale to a national level. But really, the core of a student-centric education system is a student experience, and that has to be delivered on a local level. And I don't think it scales. All right, somebody asked, are there any other families out there with long COVID or health issues that homeschool? How do they navigate low socialization and isolation from disabilities? I love this question because it's really important, and isolation when you're a kid is really hard. It's hard when you're an adult too, but I feel like the pain is maybe a little deeper and more acute if you're a child and you don't have a lot of perspective on what you're going through. This is why I think the internet has changed everything about education. Pre-internet, your ability to socially connect really was limited. If you wanted to be friends with somebody who wasn't in your immediate geographic vicinity, one, you had to find them and meet them in the first place, but two, you had to either call them on the phone or like be a pen pal and write letters. And that game is different now. Kids can sign up for online courses, they can become part of online communities, and they can make friends with kids who are located all over the world, which is amazing, not just for kids who are physically isolated or maybe geographically isolated. Like if you're homeschooling in rural Wyoming or Alaska, there probably aren't a lot of kids in your vicinity no matter what. So it allows you to have a broader social network than you would if you were just at home or just interacting with the people in your local community. But it's also really helpful for kids who have niche interests, because if you're really excited about some obscure fantasy novel, or you're really excited about designing video games, or you have any other niche interest on the planet, the probability that somebody else lives in your geographic region who shares that interest and who you also would get along with are kind of slim. But if you have the ability to find other people via the internet who share your interests, you can have a really curated friend group of people who you really connect with on the things that really matter to you. And you can connect with them no matter where they're located, which I think is a superpower for kids who have niche interests or who live in isolated areas, or who for some reason aren't able to go out into the world even if they live in a more populated area, and so feel really socially isolated. So I think the internet changes everything, and I speak from experience, having grown up with my very best friend in middle and high school, being someone who I never even met in person. We were just internet friends. We'd do Skype calls and exchange emails, and we had an amazing friendship. Um, we interacted completely via the internet, and it was I mean, honestly, just like world changing for me as a teenager to be able to have a friend that I really connected with without being limited to the people in my close geographic vicinity. So I'm a big advocate for online programs and online communities. There's lots of things that you can find as a parent that are more closely curated. It's all kids, they're all vetted. You know that there aren't weird adults lurking in the community trying to be weird with your kids. So it's spaces that you can really trust as a parent, but that can allow your kids to connect with other kids who they're actually excited to be friends with. All right, we've gone through a lot of questions. I have a few more that I'm saving up for future episodes. I will keep collecting questions if you all have more. I would love to hear your thoughts on these if you have things that you think I missed or other questions that you want me to hit in the next one of these that I do. This was honestly kind of fun. I think I will maybe do another one of these sooner rather than later. That's all for this week. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great rest of your week and a great weekend. Thanks, guys.